Welcome everyone. It is a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm Sarah Whiting, I'm the Dean. I have a small confession to make. Maybe two. One is that landscape is the department I knew the least when coming into this position, and I was very open about that, actually, with the landscape architecture department. And the other is I grew up in a city that was known for trees, Evanston, Illinois, but it was known for its elms, and you can't climb elm trees because the branches, as you all probably know, only start way up high. And so just want to put those 2 points out there. I was really delighted last night I'm supposed to start actually with, I have to back up. So let me start first by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Massachusetts people, who are the original inhabitants of Cambridge and Boston. And so I admit that first, when we were sort of all accepting that the land acknowledgement is something that we should be doing and sort of recognizing that, I thought, well, that seems very automatic and kind of pro forma. And as I've come to introduce it at every event and think about it, I've actually put much more thought into it. And I ask that everyone do the same. And so I really do think we have to pause for a moment and think about the fact that we are on land that was taken away from a population. And that's something that we don't think about at all. We don't, especially those of us who weren't born and bred landscape architects don't even think of land much. And so the idea that this was land on which another population lived and had their world, I think is something profound to consider. And as we consider different contestations, let's say, to put it in the mildest of terms, happening today across the world, I think it's something to think about very seriously. And so I have grown to really appreciate the land acknowledgement and think that we should pause for that. I'll also note that we have live captioning. So for the online audience, there's a CC icon at the bottom of the live stream player, and all of you can point your phones at the QR code. QR codes make me nervous, I have to say. I never seem to get it to work, and everyone around me seems to, so it makes me feel quite inferior. But please go ahead and use the QR code to get captioning on your phone if you would like that. All right, let me go back to where I was. So I was thrilled last night. Ned, thank you for your amazing talk, which got us to look very closely at bark, among other things. And I walked to school this morning in a very different mood. And thank you to Mayor Wu and to Eigen, to Gary and to Anita. I think it was an amazing opening to an event and a moment to really think about our forests and think about what they do now, what they have done, and what they can do in the future. I very much appreciated Ned's reference to the Goethe quote, because I often have referenced Walter Benjamin, who made a kind of similar comment about the built environment in 1936. Benjamin said, we experience architecture in a state of distraction, which for an architect is a very irritating thing to realize, but it's true. We're the most public of the arts, and yet people don't pay attention. So, similarly, as Goethe was noting, people don't look carefully, and Benjamin was saying people don't look at the buildings around them. And I've often pointed out that if Benjamin were alive today and he saw everyone on their iPhones, he would be, it would be even more confirmation that people aren't paying attention to the things around them. And so I very much appreciate that this exhibition and this symposium draw our attention to the forests. And that's something that we have to actually do actively. And what's interesting is the different media that are being used to do that. So in the exhibit, you see everything from dioramas, thank you for bringing back the diorama, Ed and Lisa, to video, to projection, to the extraordinary transformation of the columns into trees in our gallery. And then, of course, in a symposium, you have formal papers, some typed out, I see, that will be delivered, and that's one form of, one medium for delivering information and drawing our attention. But you also have conversation. That's what a symposium is, and that's why I actually appreciated that this is referenced as a symposium. And for me, conversation is ultimately the only way we're going to move forward. And so, like Ned, I would say, make sure you catch people's eye. And I would say not just when you're at the Arboretum, but on the sidewalk or walking up the stairs in the trays. I think it's important to actually initiate a conversation with people. I often will compliment someone if I like their jacket or their dog. I met quite a nice dog on the way in this morning, a small corgi. And I think that that is the only way. So we live in a society that's becoming ever more diversified, which is fabulous, and ever more dense, which is fabulous. But the only way that we can keep from being in our own little cocoons is to engage one another. And so I am very grateful for this conversation that will be generated all day today and will hopefully permeate out. And I want to echo Anita's point that that banner outside is just one version of trying to get this conversation outside. If I had my druthers, this would be a glass wall, and people would be wandering in from the street. So with that, I want to welcome Gary to the podium, but I want to really just take this moment to say thank you to everyone who's been involved in this event.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for turning out today. You'll not be surprised to learn that our students in the post-pandemic world figured out that they can be pocheting their drawings and cutting models and still watch us here. So they don't show up that much. Thank you, Sarah. I'm grateful, Sarah, for your constant support of our efforts to make visible and widely shared the work we do in landscape architecture and in this symposium, the work of colleagues in allied disciplines. We are very diverse today in response to the twin crises of climate and justice. It's great to have a chance to foreground this work for our students and faculty and our external community. We have speakers and guests who have come from so many distant places. Our farthest travelers came from Japan. Special welcome to Lian-san and Kita-san. We have Aceh from Oxford and Ghana and everywhere around the world. Michael from Italy, Sylvia and Sonia from Germany. So we have a diverse forest population here in Piper Auditorium. Again, I welcome all our speakers and guests and faculty and students, and thank you for joining what we expect to be an enlightening time in a forest of our own making. I have for a long time wanted to do something in this school that immersed everybody who walks into Gund Hall in the highly complex, fecund, and expressive world of plants. We find immense power in the expressive qualities that come through planting on the surface of the earth. Last night's event was, perhaps in an obsessive way, especially satisfying, and I too want to thank Ned again, Mayor Wu, Ed Eigen, and Anita for making it come off in a picture-perfect way. There is a long list of people to thank, and this is my time to do that, including my colleagues on the Dean's Executive Committee, who expressed enthusiastic support for the conjoining of an exhibition and symposium a year ago. I think I just made a hybrid word there. Let me also thank our department staff for their support, along with the amazing work truly amazing work of the staff and directors in GSD communications, public programs, and exhibitions. So a list here. Ken Stewart, Assistant Dean and Director of Communications and Public Programs, did a lot here. You could see him stage managing on the side last night. Paige Johnston, our former Associate Director of Public Programs who left GSD only recently. Matt Smith and his team, orchestrating, as always, with finesse. Raquel Rivera, who has just been an amazing partner for me on this, and Han Shao, her assistant. Thanks also to Joshua Mashat, who managed to get a brilliant review of the exhibition in the Globe this morning by Mark Feeney. I have to tell you, Mark Feeney really understood what he was looking at, and so please have a read. It's a good one. Chad Cloffer and Willis Kingery, who have designed our identity for both the shows and the symposium. Miguel, who is just a very organized graduate student, and he's a member of both the MARC and MLA programs. He's done a terrific job helping us. The one and only Dan Borelli, I need to thank him last night. Dan helped me to conceive the idea here a year ago. The idea of building an exhibition and a symposium directly from a project-based seminar. It wasn't easy, but he told me that he wants to do it again. I'm going to wait a while. And then Dave Zimmerman Stewart and his staff, very clever guys, very patient guys, and exacting preparators and builders. So it really does take a village. As I mentioned last evening, this isn't the first time we've examined topics pertaining to the forest, and given the increased relevance and urgency demonstrated in the exhibition, it's certain that this will be a perpetual topic of research and teaching in the department. In 2020, Anita and also the Swiss landscape architect Günter Vogt curated an exhibition entitled First the Forest. The title, you may know, was taken from the Italian Enlightenment philosopher and humanist Giambattista Vico's influential treatise of 1775, The New Science. In his quest to describe and fully interrogate universal human institutions, very Enlightenment-led, his work took him to the dark psychic associations with ancient forests and pagan antiquity that were popular in literature, especially in medieval times. But he moved quickly and predictably from the popular trope of barbarism in the forest, fear, to a rationality of civilization. So his postulation was, and I quote, "This was the order of human institutions. First, the forests. After that, the huts." Sort of like Stanley's huts in the lobby outside. Then the villages. Next, the cities, and finally, the academies. End quote. Well, whether you buy that convenient aphorism or not, here we are, bringing the forest to the academy. The current exhibition moves past Vico's fabled reading and asserts that the forest, in the long span of modernity and the Anthropocene, is a human enterprise. Anita made it clear last night. As she says in her exhibition text, the forest today is ultimately a designed condition. I would love to hear disputes of that, if there are some in the room. And that is the frame through which we will travel a transect today, from regional and metropolitan forests to the urban forest, from soil to arborescence, from the phenomenology of stems and leaves and how we see them, to the politics of dramatic carbon drawdown, from threats to hopes and grave injustices to questions of equity through the agency of the forest. So here's our plan for the day. We'll have very short introductions, and the QR code gives you a link to very ample descriptions of our speakers, and so please take advantage of that. We'll have timed 15-minute papers by 3 panelists each, followed by discussion led by moderators. So there are 4 panels. It's on a tight schedule. There is breaks in between, and we plan to end by 6 p.m. It's a long day, but it'll be a good one. The first panel is called Scaling Threats. Scaling here refers to measuring extents. Where am I? And risks, but also ascending or scaling, ways of mounting the problems we face with the forest. We will cover broad terrain, from narrative associated with Epping Forest in northeast London, home to 55,000 old-growth trees, to measuring the threats to our urban forests nationwide, and on to current plans for decarbonization here in Massachusetts. If we keep them healthy, the forest will play a vital role. The speakers will be introduced and then queried by Professor Ed Eigen, whom we heard from last night. Ed is senior lecturer in history of landscape architecture and architecture here at GSD, and the current head of the narratives domain of the Master of Design Studies program. The second panel is construed to give us ways of perceiving and reimagining our relationships to the urban forest, from soil to ground, to canopies, to sky, and to practices of silviculture and management of forests as a precarious but indispensable resource for reimagining the city's adaptive and resilient future. Our speakers for this panel will be introduced by GSD Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture, Pablo Pérez-Ramos. Pablo's own seminal work on the typologies of oases in response to extreme aridity in several parts of the world will be displayed in Gund Hall later this semester, and I commend that work to you. It's remarkable. After a lunch break, the third panel on speculating and acting brings forward current threats and recent practices from the scale of the rural village to the cities of Boston and Cambridge. These last two are well illustrated in the gallery. Actually, so is the first. And we know are of vital interest to many here in the audience today. All 3 of these talks address the inequitable distribution of impacts on historically isolated communities. Pamela Conrad, GSD lecturer in landscape architecture, will introduce the speakers. Pamela is a resident expert on carbon drawdown and climate positive design, and we're really fortunate to have her teaching in this area. Finally, we arrive at 3 papers in our final panel on how the forest plays a role in promoting public health and well-being in our cities, in the richly forested 500-year-old city of Bogota, Colombia, and in an extraction landscape in eastern Kentucky. Finally, we have a broader look at a transect of time and space in which the concerted planting of trees in the city has been seen as good for the soul and the mind, good for well-being, but increasingly threatened, and quite unevenly so. Now, Malkicho Shan, a design critic in urban planning and design, had hoped to moderate this panel, but took ill this week and had to remain at home. I'm going to take her place and hope that I can do a little bit of justice to what she would bring to questions of systemic injustice and the hope for change in that picture that we'll hear about throughout the day. With that, could you please welcome to the podium my esteemed colleague, Professor Ed Eigen. Thank you.
Good morning, all. I'm Ed Eigen. I'm a semi-professional conference moderator, and I'm here to introduce our first panel, Scaling Threats. And we'll be hearing first from me and from my cherished colleague, Lisa Haber-Thomson. Lisa is a historian interested in questions that lie at the intersection between law and architecture, and she is currently a lecturer at the GSD where she teaches studio and history courses, which is a rare feat. We'll then be hearing from Dr. Jonathan Thompson, who's a senior ecologist at the Harvard Forest, a department of Harvard University. He also leads the New England Landscape Futures Project, which collaborates with diverse stakeholders from throughout the region, and think of region, that issue of scale we'll be talking about, to build and evaluate scenarios that show how land use choices and climate change could shape the landscape for the next 50 years. Our third speaker, it will be David Nowak. Regrettably, David can't be here in person today, so he'll be joining joining us via Zoom. But David is a emeritus senior scientist with the USDA Forest Service, Northern Research Station, a truly prolific author. He also led teams developing the iTree software suite that quantifies the benefits and values from vegetation globally, so from region to globe. I'll just say a couple of very quick words by way of introduction and orientation, keeping in mind that forests are exactly the kind of places and or things or situations in and through which one typically blazes a trail. Though getting lost in the woods is not the worst thing to happen, perhaps especially when it comes to producing poetry. But losing a forest is another matter altogether. The papers this morning have as a common thread or trail of crumbs questions of law, and indeed outlaws, policy, management, and state formation. And I think here's some of the foundational texts of what we now call ecology, namely Linnaeus's Economy of Nature of 1749, followed by the Polity of Nature, i.e. the politics or police of nature. When these were written, it was understood that Providence kept the earth and all its creatures in balance. No such certainly now holds. Perhaps this is neoliberalism, and we all look forward anxiously to a future, an unblazed trail, an undiscovered country. What follows are some insights into emerging forms of law, phytopolitics, policy, and wise policing. And we begin with a historical sketch of a notorious outlaw. So please. Oh, where do I click? Sorry. Sorry, just give me where am I? Sure. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Why is it not going? Sorry, thank you. At the start of his concise history of Epping Forest of 1860, John Maynard, a working-class radical from Waltham, an ardent foe of enclosure, lamented that, quote, space precludes saying much relative to the cruelty and injustice of laws governing forest matters. So we ask, what kind of space or legal space is a forest, such that no concise measure can be given of its trespasses? Or said differently, what's the matter with the legacy of so-called fatal trees, the gallows from which unrepentant outlaws and other lesser offenders were hanged? Maynard led his readers to imagine, quote, how dreadful indeed must have been the times when the life of a deer on the forest was more valued than the life of a fellow man. This equation of the more than and less than, but altogether inhuman bloodiness of British law had earlier been expressed by the parliamentarian and abolitionist Thomas Fowell Buxton, quote, kill your father or catch a rabbit in a warren, the penalty is the same. Where and whenever boundary rights are asserted, forests make for fellows and fiends, verderers and poachers, attacks and retreats. Maynard's Waltham was the native woods of the notorious blacks, poachers engaged in criminal rural resistance. Their leaders were hanged from the Tyburn tree on December 4, 1723. A royal former hunting grounds in southwest Essex, once outside but eventually encroached upon by metropolitan London, in the early 18th century, Epping Forest served as the hideaway for the notorious highwayman Richard Dick Turpin, and was also the scene of his culminating act of violent depredation, the murder of the gamekeeper Thomas Morris. And for this, he was hanged at the York Tyburn. This is his story, and that of Epping Forest.
I'm going to take a little step maybe back and out and remind us that one of the first things that we're taught when we think about landscape and law in early modern England is that the enclosing of the commons radically transformed the geographic and legal terrain of the country. So under George II and accelerating rapidly after 1750, enclosure of the common lands by private acts of parliament was, as the landscape historian W.G. Hodgson put it, the great instrument of change, transforming a medieval agrarian society into an urban industrial one. The vast bulk of these parliamentary acts were passed between 1750 and 1850 and enclosed a total of over 6 million acres of formerly open fields, heaths, fens, moors, and wastes. So if this story rings familiar here, it is in large part because this practice of dividing up and improving land for profit exported well. And indeed, as many scholars have argued, that enclosure was perfected first in Ireland and then in the New World, where the marked boundaries of English agricultural practice were levied as evidence against long-standing ownership claims of indigenous populations. Back in England, this period of rapid enclosures marked the definitive transition away from lingering feudal societal structures, accompanied by an increasingly restricted access to spaces formerly used uncontested by the working poor. So basically, this is a story about the rise of a propertied class staged against the proletariat. And these enclosing acts are a really useful way to tell the story because the lines of tight hedgerows creeping across the English landscape makes visible, sorry, excuse me, I have to cough. I'm sorry. That's better, sorry. These tight hedgerows creeping across the English landscape makes visible and highly legible these changing social and legal patterns. But as with many developments in legal history, things are more complicated and much more interesting than this story might at first suggest. And herein lies the forest. Rather than a clear and definite act that fundamentally transformed relationships between rural and urban, between rich and poor, a walk through the forests, accompanied by the outlaws that inhabited them, reveals a much more nuanced road to modernity than we might at first suggest. Dick Turpin's Epping Forest lay at these margins. That is to say, the forest inscribed a transient space between the capital of capitalist accumulation, London, and the ever-shrinking spaces of subsistence economies. Turpin was an outlaw, no doubt, but many of the actions for which he stood trial would have only recently been criminalized. The forest also thus makes visible an indistinct temporal shift as working people engage in modes of resistance against newly restructured property regimes. Now, it's important to remember that the forest was never a lawless place, and we have evidence of royal hunting privileges in England since at least Alfred, so he was one of the great Anglo-Saxon kings of the 9th century. Under Henry II, the law of the forest in the 12th century, which gave the king the special privilege of hunting deer, expanded rapidly and may have covered over a third of the country. And while this royal privilege might seem extensive, it was in large part tempered by a wide acceptance of the fact that farmers and peasants made daily use of the forest for themselves. So it was widely accepted that even though the forest was sort of a privileged royal hunting grounds, everyday people also used the forest, and that was widely accepted. But this attitude was beginning to change in the early 18th century, culminating in the Waltham Black Acts. This act, which was enacted in May of 1723, originated in response to an outbreak of organized poaching in Windsor Forest and near Waltham, and declared that traveling in woodland areas in disguise or with a blackened face, hence the Black Act, was a felony punishable by death. In the few years that followed, an increasing number of outlawed actions were added, such that it became a sort of compendium of rural disorder. So now outlawed, in addition, was hunting or wounding deer, cutting down trees, poaching hares or fish, traveling on highways or in the forest in disguise, or cutting down trees and ruining hedges, and among many other things. So the Black Act exemplified the height of draconian 18th century legislation, which increasingly restricted the movement of poor people. The state, it was increasingly felt by the upper classes, existed in large part to defend against the propertied classes. In rural England, as in the rapidly growing urban centers of London, Liverpool, and so on, long-standing commoning practices were codified and then outlawed altogether. The Waltham Black Act, according to the Ordinary of Newgate, he was the chaplain in charge of London's most notorious jail, had two severe consequences. First, it caused poachers to organize with discipline, working at night and traveling in large groups. And second, by imprisoning these people, allowed these networks of poachers to expand. In other words, the Black Act and others like it began to shape connections between and among poor rural farmers and those in London's provisioning trades, who were likewise finding it increasingly difficult to earn a living wage. Richard Turpin was one of these people. Like many of the bandits, brigands, housebreakers, jailbreakers, and highwaymen that populated the legal 18th century imagination, the circumstances of Turpin's life were perfectly ordinary, and this ordinariness no doubt contributing to his popularity. The son of an Essex farmer, Turpin completed his apprenticeship with a Whitechapel butcher. Some records suggest that he opened a small butcher shop the following year. But London in the early 18th century, it was increasingly harder to run a viable business. Rising costs of rent and food meant that many struggled to cover their expenses solely through honest trade. Needs could be met, of course, by stepping outside the moneyed economy. So like many others of his generation, Dick Turpin began to supplement his income along the provisioning roads to London, roads especially familiar among butchers on account of their necessary connections between the livestock feeds and the market. At first, he stole cattle to sell the hides at Waltham Abbey and the meat in the markets in London. Fleeing a warrant put out for his arrest, he joined a gang of deer stealers based in Epping Forest and its surrounds. The next 4 years of his life, he became legend. Turpin was a robber and a highwayman, but he was also a hero. Enormous crowds were present at his hanging, and these sympathetic onlookers even rescuing his body from the gallows in order to stay the eager hands of the surgeons who competed for cadavers of those hanged. Immediately, rumors sprung up that he had been resuscitated, that the wrong man had been killed. Should this popularity surprise us? For the landed aristocracy, England's bloody code promised a way to subdue the rowdy populace and to protect their amassing wealth. But for those at the sharp end of the law's spear, these codes provided fertile grounds for new forms of political awareness. Entangled within the legal history of Epping Forest is evidence of sovereign authority bolstering new justifications for capital accumulation, but also evidence of a rich history of resistance against it. And despite all attempts to vilify, the forest highwaymen had a certain moral authority, even if they did not have a legal authority. When Thomas Easter, a Norwich butcher turned highwayman, heard his victim's protest, "I took you for an honest man," Easter replied, "So I am, because I rob to the rich and I give to the poor."
So just for a concluding section and to say a bit about those rumors to which Lisa alluded, let us return to the 19th century and the attempts of Maynard and others to paint not only a historical portrait of Turpin, but also to survey the bounds of lawfulness of his own time. Like a forest undergoing succession, the identity of villains and victims, heroes and outlaws undergoes change. In his attempt to write a, quote, full and trustworthy history of the career of Richard Turpin, the Essex County antiquarian Thomas Succombe promised to work up his subject with, quote, befitting amount of scholarly apparatus and erudite detail. Good luck. A fugitive from justice, Turpin proved to be an exemplarily elusive historical subject, perhaps especially when it was recalled that the notion of exemplarity itself derives from the medieval Latin word for a clearing in the woods. Among the many other ingraftings of fact and fancy in the annals of Turpiniana, Succombe was particularly bemused by the frequency which with Turpin oaks are strewn about England. Turpin's oak, most famously the one at Finchley, was said to be the tree behind which the outlaw stationed himself when he was, quote, intent upon a freebooting errand in this part of the country. In other words, the tree was his ambush. The tree gave him cover, its closeness to the high road allowing him to rob the mails and commercial travelers. Galls of another stripe, it was said that from time to time pistol balls were extracted from the oak's bark, which had been discharged at the trunk to deter highwaymen. What is somewhat more certain is the tree where Turpin met his mortal end. Tried at the York Assize on March 22nd, 1738, on the charge of stealing a black mare and foal at Welton, Turpin, like many others accused of property offenses in the wake of England's bloody code, was sentenced to death. Turpin's place of execution at Knavesmire was modeled on London's gallows, known as the Tyburn tree, quote, because benefactors were at one time hung on the elm trees which grew on the banks of the small stream called Tyburn. Kind of a diminished pastoral vision there. England's fatal trees did not protect highwaymen, but rather betrayed them. Even here, in the otherwise incontrovertible fact of his death, there remained room for doubt. Was it really Turpin who had been hanged? One convict claimed it was rather one of Turpin's confederates who had met his end at Knavesmire, and that Turpin himself was still carrying on his depredations in Epping Forest. But Succombe was quick to qualify this claim, noting that, quote, jailbirds are proverbial marvel mongers of the most mendacious order. A bit like historians. Okay. Where does that leave Seccombe's attempt to render a full and trustworthy history of Turpin? Perhaps the best and at the same time the most umbrageous evidence is to be found between these two witness trees in Epping Forest itself. On the Lamb, in 1737, Turpin and his confederates sought refuge there, digging a cave, quote, hidden by ferns and brambles, hazels and thorns. And from the vantage of this cave, he set upon any number of forest victims. The violent fate met by those who sought Turpin's arrest, most notably Thomas Morris, a servant of the keeper Thomas Morris of Epping Forest, cemented in place the legend of the highwaymen's depredations. This violent fate was eagerly seized upon by 19th century commentators whose aim was, in part, to paint a specific picture of the unlawfulness of the preceding era. While undoubtedly a hero in his own time, Turpin's canonization was obscured in the 19th century as reformers aimed to strike down England's bloody codes. So enough of rumors, I end with a bit of evidence. And I turn here to the diorama in the exhibit just outside. Despite his intention to produce an exhaustive iconographia Turpiniana, Seccombe allowed that the restrictions of time and place, again, limited him merely to stating that engravings of the bandit in his cave have been selected with the utmost care as being the least authentic of all the counterfeit presentiments of our hero. And with that beguiling Shakespearean turn of phrase, Seccombe disposed of the whole, quote, carcass of the historical Richard Turpin and turned instead to the, quote, most vital of the whole subject, the evergreen legend, which has become associated for all time with his name. Thus, we have the pseudo-Turpin we still contend with. So, the diorama of Turpin's cave lair is modeled on a Regency-era toy theater and serves as the stage to survey the far from peaceable history of Epping Forest. Quote, has not everyone noticed how sweet and startling any landscape looks when seen through an arch? C.K. Chesterton asked in his essay on toy theaters. But the landscape seen through the oculus of Turpin's cave, or rather the images on the screen, truly a monitor, behind it, tell us a story not of sweetness, but of strife. Why a diorama? Intrinsic to the philosophy of toy theaters, Chesterton adds, is that, quote, by reducing the scale of events, it can introduce much larger events. And what can be larger? What matters more than questions of property or boundary rights when the cost of violating them is literally life and limb? Thank you very much. Hey, look. Oh, sorry. My hosting duties. Thomas, yeah, sorry, I'm being discombobulated here. It's my great honor now to introduce Jonathan Thomas to the stage. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. Now for something completely different. I am the research director and a senior ecologist at the Harvard Forest, which is a 4,000-acre research forest about 70 miles west of here. I hope you all come to visit if you haven't already. I will note if the laser works. See this tower and this tower. Those are two of our now 5 eddy flux towers measuring the transfer of carbon between the atmosphere and the biosphere. I mention them while this picture is up because I'm going to speak to some data from those towers later. But before that, I wanted to give one short plug for the Harvard Forest in hopes that the design school will take greater advantage of it. It's about an hour away, not too bad. And I like to say that we're the most studied forest in the world. It's a hard thing to measure, and so I'm willing to have that fight. There's a few forests that for 125 years have been so systematically studied. What you see here is one of our more iconic experiments. In its 36 years running, we have been warming the soils 5 degrees C above ambient to understand what will happen to all the carbon that is stored below ground. which is about half of the total amount of carbon in the system. On days like this morning, when there's a little snow, you can really, this really pops out. And what we've learned is that it drives evolution, it drives the metabolism of microbes, and it creates new communities, and it also blows off all that stored carbon, increasing the threat of climate change. Here you can see one of our summer students measuring in our forest geoplot, where we have 170,000 individual stems. We measure every one of them that's bigger than your pinky finger every 5 years, and we track how much they grew, which ones died, which ones lived. Here is Megan and Andrew up on one of those flux towers, also instrumented and measuring about everything you can imagine. Here's Linda Mapes, a journalist, part of our Bullard Fellowship program. She spent a year writing a book about the forest called The Witness Tree. So it was with the knowledge about forest ecosystems and their role in the climate system that the then Governor Charlie Baker approached me and asked if I would write the land sector report, one of 7 reports documenting the carbon implications. All the other sectors, as you can see, building, electricity, transportation, non-energy here represented in this graph, are emissions only. The land sector is unique in that the arrows point both directions. We both emit carbon from the land sector when we cut down the trees, and we sequester carbon as the trees grow. This figure shows what we must achieve, both legislatively and morally and for our own survival over the next coming decades. You can see the diminishment of each of the emissions from this sector as we electrify the economy with green sources. But this is an important part that I want to draw your attention to. This 15% in the year 2050, no one really thinks we can achieve that. Squeezing out the last bit of emissions will be exceedingly hard unless we all want to be the first ones to fly in the solar planes. There will be jet fuel needed and other fossil fuels. And so the law allows for 15% of 1990 level emissions to reach zero through carbon capture. Right now, the only way we have to do this at scale is photosynthesis, trees, forests. And so the state is looking to the forest to meet this 15%. Unfortunately, they signed this law before they asked any of us or me how much carbon the forest sequesters. And so that's what we'll talk about a bit now. Which button? Here we are. So remember, I pointed at those towers. These are the data from those towers. This green one is the longest running eddy flux tower in the world. My colleague Steve Wolfsey from EPS, just across the street, built this tower actually in 1988. I was in 8th grade when he built it. No one had built a tower like that before. 10 minutes in or 10 minutes to go? To go. Thank you. That's important distinction. At that time, they'd only been built in agricultural fields. And so it was kind of audacious to build one in the forest. And Steve admits that he didn't even know if it would be standing in a year, let alone 40 years later. And what you can see is since then, about 6 times per second, that tower has measured the fluxes of carbon moving from the atmosphere into the forest and back. Why does it go up and down each year? Somebody yell it out. Thank you, seasons. And so when Steve built this, the conventional wisdom was that this would be roughly flat. It would bounce around in a dynamic equilibrium. The trees there were about 100 years old at that time, now about 140 years old. And we thought that the sink was essentially full, that we had this shifting mosaic. So this comes as a great surprise. What we've seen is there's now 60% more carbon in that forest than there was when Steve built it. This is a tremendous ecosystem service, right? All that carbon came out of the atmosphere and now is in the forest. In 2005, we built another tower in a hemlock forest. It's only about a half a mile away. You can see at first it was growing at the same rate as this oak forest was growing. Doesn't bounce up and down. Why? Hemlocks are evergreen. The leaves don't fall off, right? So you can see that right in that blue line. What's this then? That is what's called the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a little aphid-like bug that was introduced from Asia in the 50s and is now decimating hemlock species, which will be extinct here in a decade, I'd say. And so this is going down. This graph is a little old. I apologize for that. I have a new one, and it shows that it's starting to go back up again as the black birch is establishing under the forest where the hemlock once lived and starting to take up carbon. This last one is a tower we built right after we did a clear cut. And this one shows the resilience of New England forest, a place that just wants to be a forest. Just stop mowing your lawn if you want to test that proposition. And you see for 4 years, it emitted more carbon than it took up. And this was as all the roots decomposed and all the branches went. The big parts left on a truck, but the rest of the slash decomposed. But within 4 years, the pin cherry established, and by 8 years, it had gained all the carbon back. And this, we actually took the tower down, but having walked through that forest many, many times, I can tell you that that line would keep going up and up. So this is why we believe the forest can meet that 15% goal, yes? But what about its scale? Well, those things measure less than an acre of area, but Massachusetts is 56% forested. We have roughly 3 million acres of forest, depending on how you measure it. That's 1.5 billion live trees, 1.2 gigatons worth of carbon dioxide equivalents. To put that in perspective, if somehow all the forests in Massachusetts were to go up in smoke today, up into the atmosphere, I don't think that would happen, but if it did, that would be the equivalent of the last 15 years of our fossil fuel emissions blowing off at one time. So this, for me, is a call to remember the stocks of carbon that are the accumulation of the sequestration. There's a lot of emphasis on sequestration. In fact, the law only mentions sequestration. It does not measure stocks. So I build simulation models to look into the future. I don't have much time, so I'm just going to jump to the end and not actually talk much about those models. But I ran those models for the state as part of this land sector analysis for the decarbonization pathway. What's nice about the models is you can turn things on and off. And what I showed here was that if you just allow the forest to grow, in 30 years, you would have about half as much carbon again as what's in them now, if there was no land use at all. But if you turn on the land use switch, the amount of carbon decreases by about 7%. Turn on timber harvest, which is, we don't think of in Massachusetts. I did all my graduate work in Oregon, where forestry is big business, cover of the newspaper. We don't think about it as much in Massachusetts, but it's a dominant agent of change, and in fact reduces carbon by 8%, slightly more. You can see that it occurs on about 5 times as many acres as does permanent forest loss. I should note that they did not have me look at solar, which has become the leading cause of deforestation in the state. We are cutting down our forests to build solar panels totally unnecessarily. I just did a big report on that, and I'm happy to talk about it if you want to do it. But at that time, just 3 years ago, the state didn't see it as an issue, and we didn't incorporate it. But there are several, and so this came out, and we said, okay, you can get 34% more carbon, the equivalent of 10% of 1990 emissions right now, right? That's under the recent trends. Keep doing what we're doing, and the trees continue to grow as the model believes they will, right? That means that if we change, we could increase that by about 15% and get up around 12%. So the 15% that the policy speaks to is somewhat questionable, just given the system. When this came out, a lot of folks came back at us and said, well, we can fix this through forestry. We can do improvement silviculture, and we can increase the rate. So since then, I continued to work with the state, and this is just like the bottom line. There was about 1 million different analyses that went into this. But so this is the growth of this is just a no disturbance and no harvest run. The green to the left shows the growth. The blue to the right shows the emissions from tree death, and the diamond is the net between those two, right? And so now we can start incorporating things. So here we include disturbances, but not hurricanes, but natural disturbances. And the diamond does not move very much. Indeed, now we include a bunch of harvesting, and again, it doesn't move. As we increase the growth, we tend to increase the emissions almost proportionally, so that the net effect of these things doesn't change very much until we start to introduce hurricanes, which both increase the amount of growth as we remove the older trees, which grow slower than the younger trees, but we also emit a lot more. And we can show that the hurricanes, though, at net, loom as the largest threat to the carbon sink and the ability to continue to sequester carbon in the future. This study continues and isolates factors of different insects. We now have beech leaf disease. We now have emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and that is, to me, the invasive insects are sort of the fire of the East. In Western forests, the story is all about wildfire. In Eastern forests, the story should be all about hurricanes and insects. So my last slide here is, so what is the role of the forest? For me, I would like to see a lot more focus on stewarding our stocks and a lot less focus on trying to goose sequestration this way or that. We are stewards of this incredible stock of forest, and we should appreciate that and not turn them into emissions. Yes, reducing the rate of forest loss, especially loss to solar, should be a priority, but the scale at which we can affect this is small relative to the size of the system. Limiting harvesting could help, and I just was on the governor's commission for this. But unless we talk about changing consumption patterns, we're just going to move the harvesting out of state, and the atmosphere has no idea what state it was harvested in, so it doesn't really matter, except to meeting the law. And that we really ought to expect natural disturbances to constrain. That's sort of the bad news and the will the forest save us all. I think the forest will save us all, but we shouldn't count on it so that we can keep polluting, right? And unfortunately, through carbon offsets and net zero policies, the real bottom line of that is, can we keep polluting if we count on our forest? So that's all I have for you today. Thanks very much.
Sorry I couldn't be there today. I have COVID running through my house right now, but I appreciate the opportunity to present to you. We have another shift here right now. I'm going to shift to urban forestry and talk about 5 takeaways of why we need to plan and manage urban forests across the globe. So let's get started. First of all, the reason we need to have planning is that trees are quite valuable. I'm going to go through some of the attributes of why trees are valuable to people in residence. So basically what we have is we put trees around where people are concentrated within urban centers, and actually the value of the tree will increase because of its impact on the human population. And it's not so much about the number of trees as it is about the leaf area, because most of the values derived from the urban forest come from the exchange of gases at the leaf surfaces. So with the stomates open during the daytime, they exchange carbon dioxide, evaporate water, remove pollutants through that. So it's getting that shading capacity in the cities and this gas movement going on that leads to most of the values that are derived from the urban forest. And there's multiple benefits that humans receive from the trees around them within their cities. To me, the number one is air temperature cooling, particularly with climate change coming on now. Again, that evaporative cooling is huge in the shading of surfaces, which then have impacts on energy effects of how much energy we consume. If you affect energy, therefore you affect the emissions from power plants, which then affects carbon cycling back in. So if you can reduce energy use within cities, you don't burn fossil fuels in the first place and you emit that carbon back to the atmosphere. So this attributes about trees of cooling the environment are huge. Second, these are my top 10 actually in order. Socioeconomic and aesthetics. People respond to seeing vegetation, their brainwave patterns change, cortisol levels in their body change, they have a relaxation effect. So planting these trees in the environment where people reside can have huge impacts on human health. Air quality improvement comes from the gas exchange. The pollutants are outside the leaves, higher concentrations. When the stomates open in the daytime, the gas goes interior to the leaves, and many of the gases are removed. And they also capture particles on their outer surfaces of the leaves and the bark. Water quality improvements related to changing the water flows. Evaporation, again, dries the soils out, allow water to get back into the soils, and also intercept water so the water evaporates back to the atmosphere before it even gets to the ground. And as John was talking about, greenhouse gas reduction, the absorption of carbon directly into the plants. I mean, of all the benefits that we have, carbon is the only one you can actually see. You can see the carbon accumulating in the biomass of the tree as the tree gets bigger. A lot of these other ones cannot be seen in the background. And you can read the other ones. UV radiation, the last one I'll talk about is trees absorb 96%, the tree leaves absorb 96% of ultraviolet radiation. So if we plant our forest around where people reside, let the trees absorb the UV radiation, reduce the incidences of skin cancer and cataracts associated with high UV radiation loads. So we have multiple benefits that are derived by these forests. I'm just going to go deeply more into two. This is a paper we did just recently, increasing tree cover by 10% in 10 cities across the United States. And this is the average temperature change of those 10 cities across the year. So you can see it ranges from 0.1 degree reduction to up to maybe 0.7 in Phoenix. So that's on average, but the impact of that is not so much the temperature change, in fact, but the impact on heat-related mortalities. So this is the results that we're finding from looking at, by reducing those temperatures in the cities, the amount of deaths that are avoided per year, and the percent change, in the middle column there, you can see the percent change in reduction of heat-related mortality ranges from around 3 to 4% up to 20% in Phoenix. And these, based on statistical value of human life, these are in values of billions of dollars per city per year by cooling the environment. So that's why I think, number one, air temperature cooling is the biggest benefit we can have because of this temperature reduction on direct impacts on human health, but also affects emissions from multiple sources, affects pollution. So temperature is huge. So we're talking billions alone in a single city. And then combining some of the other ones we looked at nationally, air pollution removal, looking at the impacts on human health, direct energy conservation, sequestration of carbon, and the avoided emissions because you had energy conservation. You get another $18 billion in value across the nation. And putting in perspective, about 3.5% of the United States is classified as urban, and about 39% of the urban areas are occupied by tree cover. So you have a small land base with about 39% tree cover, providing billions of dollars of benefits across the nation. Number two for planning and management, change is inevitable. We all know this. We tend to forget this. You can see the historical changes, and this is Chicago from 1780s up to 2020. And what we want to do with planning and management is guide this change to a desirable outcome. And we have various threats that are going to be coming up that we're going to have to deal with in terms of that are going to change the forest. Change is going to happen regardless of whether we manage it or not. The hope is we can direct this into positive fashion to create better future forests. This is projected urbanization across the United States between 2010 and 2060. We're going to go from about 3.6% in 2010 to 8.6%, given the patterns that have occurred in the last 20 years. And you can see the areas that are already urbanized are going to become more urbanized with more land classified as urban. What we're not doing is we're not creating new cities in the center of North Dakota. We are expanding out on the urban base that we already have. And as you can see in certain areas like around Atlanta and Chicago, we're getting a donut hole effect, is that those areas are totally urbanized and that now the urbanization is moving out to the fringe. And you can see the Northeast Corridor, too, is going to have a massive urban expansion. And that is going to impact the urban forest structure in the future through development. Forces for change, basically you have to look at the combination when you're trying to guide how the forest is going to be in the future. You have humans and nature interacting, which have impacts on both increasing tree cover and decreasing tree cover. So the common attribute about what humans do to increase tree cover is we plant trees. Climate change also indirectly might increase tree cover through increased growth. Nature also increases, as John was talking about, the cover within our forest through natural regeneration. Trees are coming in. But on the negative side, we also have humans removing trees, mowing, the development patterns we just talked about, transporting insect and disease, impacts of climate change. You have many things that are going to reduce tree cover. On the same side, nature is also going to do that through the insects and diseases, old age, fires, storms, and droughts, things like that. So we have a combination of what nature is doing to change the forest and what humans are doing. And what we're trying to do is guide this through planning and management. And we're going to have several more threats coming up in the coming years to urban forests. We did a paper on relative threats across the United States, and we looked at every county relative to all the other counties, looking at the various factors related to climate change, insects and diseases, and storms. And you can see the results here from Middlesex County in Cambridge there. Cambridge, or Middlesex County, rates 42 in the nation out of over 3,000 counties, so it's in the top 2% of areas at risk to change due to various factors in the urban forest. And you do not want to be in the top percentage of these. You want to be at the lower end. So as you get to the more oranges and the reds, the higher the risk you are relative to the other areas in the United States. So you can see this Middlesex County is at relatively high risk for air temperature change and precipitation changes projected coming over the next, between 2010 and 2060. Also fairly high for aridity changes and fairly high for insects and disease changes. Relatively low risk from flooding, sea level rise, wildfires, tornadoes, ice storms, and a little bit higher for hurricanes. John was alluding to hurricanes being a bigger influence on changing the forest. Hurricanes will have a huge impact on forests when they come through, but relative to the rest of the United States, the hurricane risk is not as high as, let's say, you are in Florida or Georgia and other places where hurricanes can be more intense. But again, any one of these risks can change the forest rapidly in the future. So we need to understand these threats and work with them to try and guide the forest to be a healthy forest, sustainable, to provide environmental benefits for people in the coming years. Number 3, most cities are losing tree cover and gaining impervious. So we're losing an evaporative cooling, and we're warming our cities by putting on more impervious cover. And what that means is you're going to have a loss of services not only to humans, but also to wildlife through the future. So we want to sustain the forest cover in order to sustain the benefits that we have associated with the trees. Some numbers that we know about: average tree cover globally is 26, in urban areas is 26.5%. Cambridge is 26 itself. Varies by continent. You can see the numbers there yourself. North America is the highest. Why does it vary by continent? It has to do with the ecoregion and with the cities are developed in. Cities developed in forested regions have about 30% tree cover. Cities developed in grasslands, about 18% tree cover, and deserts, 12%. Why is that? I mean, 75% of the world lives within forested regions. The reason that people tend to be associated with trees has to do with water. We both need water to survive. Change in tree cover globally, slight reduction between 2012 and 2017. It dropped by 0.2%. All continents dropped except for Europe. Europe actually went up by 0.3%. At the same time, impervious cover went up by 1.6% globally, highest in South America. So again, we're seeing this global trend of increasing impervious cover in our cities and reducing tree cover, which is going to equate for more environmental issues we have to deal with in the coming years. The United States, same type of trend going on. You can see in this graphic, the left-hand side is tree cover change in urban areas in the United States between 2009 and 2014. The right-hand graph is changes in impervious cover. So if you're in the oranges to the deeper reds, that's the worse off you're going to be. On the, left-hand side, the tree cover, as it gets higher, it's greater loss of tree cover. The hash bar shows states that statistically significant changes. But pretty much for tree cover, almost every state except for 2 that are shown there had a reduction in tree cover during that period, and all states had an increase in impervious cover during that same time frame. So the United States dropped from 40.4% tree cover to 39.4% tree cover in that 5-year period, while impervious cover increased by about the same amount, from 25.7 to 26.6 impervious cover. So globally, we're increasing impervious, reducing tree cover. United States, we're increasing impervious, reducing tree cover. And even at the city level, we have the same thing going on here. You can see Boston's 4 from the left there. 18 of the 20 cities had reductions in tree cover when we did an analysis. You can see the years of the change. Look at New Orleans, which is about 6th from the right. That they lost about 1/3 of their cover, and we specifically looked at that one. That was the impact of the Hurricane Katrina. So you have massive losses of tree cover change due to storm events that occur in relatively short periods of time. Only one city had an increase of an impervious or in tree cover during this period, and that's Syracuse, where I was living at the time. I like to say I was out there planting trees, but it wasn't me. Basically, what happened in that city, there was a storm that occurred prior, major storm that occurred prior to in the late 1990s, opened up a lot of space, much development going on with a poor economy. So this is all natural regeneration that's coming in from unmanaged lands or undeveloped lands. And most of that is coming in through invasive and pioneer species. So the forest is shifting because of natural regeneration, particularly of invasive species. Number 4, you don't have to plant your way out of this. Most trees in cities come from natural regeneration and are not planted. Only 1 in 3 trees are actually planted in urban areas. It has to do with partly with population density. As population density goes up, tree planting rates go up. As the land is more managed, tree planting rates tend to go up. And as you mowing is the 3 reasons why we don't have more trees in cities. 1 is lack of water. 2 is high impervious cover. And 3 is when there's not impervious cover, we are mowing back the forest in the forested areas that we have. So what I'm saying here is basically for planning and management, use natural regeneration. You don't have to plant your way out of the forest. You can use natural regeneration. And lastly, number 5, monitoring is critical to planning. We need to follow what's going on. So Cambridge has an urban forest management plan or report. Basically, you assess the resource, you understand what the resource does, plan where you want to be, you implement the plan, and that's all great and good, but we have to monitor to see if you're going forward to get there. So if we say, well, my goal is to go from 20% to 25% tree cover in 5 years, basically monitoring close the loops and goes back to step 1 where you reassess the resource, see if you're on track, adjust your plan, and it has to be done every 5 to 10 years to make sure you're moving the forest in the right direction. And lastly, I'll end with a tool that we built, iTree. There are tools available for monitoring cover and monitoring field plots directly from the tools themselves. But here, basically, monitoring cover. It's a random sampling procedure that anybody can do with Google, where you look at paired images and see if how the cover has changed in whatever period of time between the images. But monitoring is critical for sustaining urban forest populations and planning and management. With that, I thank you, and I think I'm at about 15 minutes. Sorry I couldn't be there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and David and Lisa. I just have just a couple of general comments, and then we could open it up to discussion and followed by questions and comments from the audience, of course. Just to mark a shift from last night to this morning, Ned led us so beautifully through a discussion of seeing, particularly Goethe's idea of thinking and seeing. And what I noticed this morning is a shift from seeing to watching. And the first image we saw were watchtowers. Jonathan mentioned monitors. Again, David spoke extensively of the need of monitoring, and which means we're on alert. And with Jonathan's paper, this is very clearly expressed with the, and I want to put Jonathan in dialogue with Lisa in a moment, because Lisa is a scholar of carceral landscapes, but the repetition of the words in Jonathan's talks of capture and release, sequestration, things which have to be managed and contained and or released, or their passage needs to be very carefully policed in a way. And it kind of recovers earlier phrases we had for people who occupy the forest, like wardens or keepers. So the need for us to be on constant watch, even to the point when you spoke of forest stocks, my mind went to the word stockade, where the tree is being used literally as something to kind of keep things in check, as it were, whether it's people or gases, which are wild. Sylvestrous was the word for chaotic gases. I want to put that in relation to David's talk, where again he used and he ended with this term monitoring, keeping watch, and I'd even be more specific about it and say keeping account, keeping tabs. And this registers in two ways. One, it goes back to my comment having to do with Linnaeus and the economy of nature. And when he used the word economy, he meant ecos, the household economy, a quite literal balancing of the books of inputs and outputs and keeping all things in check and intact. And what David and Jonathan were showing us in different ways were issues of flux or a mismatch of input or output or a different way of finding a new balance, which might or might not be static. And along with that, clearly, societal costs and benefits. And the last thing I'll say about there, going to the theme of scale, is the very interesting use of graphs and tables and statistics themselves to portray this problem. Obviously, Lisa and I work more in text and image of a different description, but we too had a monitor. But I mention that only because of, with relation to scale again, the origins of botanical geography as such, as a scientific discipline in the 19th century, coming out of the sciences of what were then called Tabellenstatistik, or table statistics, which were enumerative practices of counting, marking, mapping, and kind of finding how these effects are distributed and, again, are economic, social, legal relations to them. So those are just some general comments, but maybe just for David and Jonathan, because you both used the word, address this issue of monitoring. What's our task right now?
Do you want to start it? Oh. It's an interesting idea. I mean, much of what I do we refer to as bookkeeping analysis, and trying to do that over a long temporal scope means long-term monitoring, which has, in my world, a lot of technological associations, whether it be those eddy flux towers or increasingly satellite data, which is able to monitor trees and carbon fluxes from the trees. The thing I didn't talk about that I think is relevant here is, in the terms of a bookkeeping analysis, we are really just paying back a carbon debt in this landscape, and a debt that is owed in the terms of forests from the colonial European colonization period, where Massachusetts was probably at the nadir around 30% forested, and that 30% that remained was heavily cut over. And so that remains the driving force of that upward slope of that flux tower, and we're paying that back. It's interesting that we don't know how long that will go up, and that we monitor it, but not with really no idea. The forest will not keep growing indefinitely. They're not redwoods, so they won't get that big. There's an argument that they're nearing the dynamic equilibrium, but there was that argument existed in the 80s too. So I think it's anyone's guess. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm riffing on some of those ideas. So.
The idea of debt is beautiful. One thinks we've placed a mortgage on nature, as it were. David, do you want to? It's hard to.
Yeah, I think monitoring is critical both from urban and rural society to understand how things are changing. One is to take stock of what you have, but what's particularly in cities, we don't understand how our cities are changing, at least the vegetation. In many cases, we don't even know what we have within our cities. Even less so, we know how it's changing, but that's going to drive the future and try to sustain healthy forests is one, take stock, two, monitor those changes of the landscape, particularly the vegetation that's going on.
Thank you. And just to address something that came up in both the talks, and which, again, as a non-expert would have at first seemed to me an externality, and for the two of you is very much central to the story, which are hurricanes or storm events. And from a literary perspective, I think of some of the great precursors of the literature of environment, Daniel Defoe's book, The Storm, or John Ruskin's The Storm Cloud of the 19th century. And now we're realizing these aren't passing events. They're quite central generators to to our ecosystems. I found that very fascinating and be very happy to hear you elaborate. And just on a personal note, I'm teaching a seminar this semester on insects, so I was very happy to hear they have a central role in this story as well. But
I'm sad to hear that they have a central role, but with regard to hurricanes, this is something we've been working on a lot lately. They are not as common a feature on the landscape as they are in the southeast, but consider the 1938 hurricane took out 70% of the forest cover throughout central Massachusetts. It's these rare but super impactful disturbance events can just reset the clock, and we're not very good at dealing with that type of risk, right? And so I don't know what, I did the analysis for the state so that they, in the West, when you buy carbon credits, you have to pay into what's called a buffer pool for wildfire, and so the question was, what should the buffer pool be for the net zero policies with regard to hurricanes? And so that's why we were doing the analysis. I got a really interesting pushback that I liked a lot recently. It was like, why are we making the land sector, bake in the risk to hurricanes where you don't do that in the building sector, you don't do that in any other sector, and they would use a ton more carbon if we knock down all the houses. You'd go back and rebuild them, and that would be brought into the calculations, and they would have to put that in their emissions. Why is the land sector set to this burden? I just think that's a good question. My answer to that is we should, and so should they.
I'm sorry. I was wondering, Lisa, do you want to? Yeah. But again, these kind of legal, social, juridical regimes of allocating risk and reward is quite fascinating. Our students I mentioned to you earlier are just absolutely invested in the types of research and technologies you're developing, and whether it's forest fire or other events which kind of modify our forests in dramatic, generative ways. I was going to go to the audience. Yeah. Please.
So, Jonathan, you brought up stewardship, and in the realm of forest carbon, there's arguments made around proforestation and protecting these resources, kind of a handoff. Where do you lie in the role of humans in kind of stewarding carbon, and what does that entail?
I marvel at the marketing around the term proforestation, which
Sorry, just for
so
me to ask.
what does proforestation mean?
So there's a group about protecting, allowing forests to deforest, and that they will essentially take care of themselves versus a guided hand that the carbon can just be stored in the forest.
Right. So it's the wilderness movement with a new name on it is how I see it. But it's been remarkably successful. Bill Muma and a few others have been working on that. I come down squarely in the middle, right? I'm trained as a forester, and I see many applications for using wood. And what the proforestation group never talks about is consumption, and that's where I get frustrated with them. There are many reasons that you would use wood over other materials, right? And I also marvel at farmers in the agricultural community and how they've romanticized local food. I really wish we could have a local wood movement that was as powerful, but I never see 2x4s at my farmer's market. I wish I did. So I see a lot of angles for management. However, I don't dispute that the forests need us. Like, it isn't that I have some hubristic idea that if we don't manage them, they can't exist. To the contrary, we need them. And sometimes we need their resources, just like we need to grow food. And when we do it, we ought to do it well. And so I want forestry to be local, and the idea in Massachusetts that they should put a lot of barriers up to forestry. Like I mentioned, it will just leak out of state unless you deal with the consumption aspect of it. So let's talk about doing forestry well rather than shutting it down altogether and pushing it out of sight and importing it from where trees don't grow back if you don't mow their lawn, like boreal forest, where we now get 1 2x4 per spruce tree that's 90 years old. And that's just a criminal way to do it.
just want to get Lisa into the conversation, but following Jonathan's comment, it occurred to me from your set of references for a forest to be in some sense a ward of the state, to be something to be watched over, governed, corrected, and the kind of contract that's implied in that relationship, as opposed to just letting it go wild.
Well, and it always or at least, is this on? Yeah. As long as we have written records, the forest has been governed in different kinds of ways. But there's also been wiggle room, I guess is maybe not the academic way to say it, but wiggle room in terms of how that management truly operates on the ground. So until very recently, historically, if we're thinking about it, yes, it was governed by what we would now call state authority, but it was also very much used actively by people who are living in and near forests. And those are the records that are harder to see, the bandits, I guess, that we're so interested in. And I think it's important to remember that the bandits will always be there, I guess, too, I think.
Thanks for that comment, Lisa. Of course, immediately, John Evelyn comes to mind. In, I think, early 17th century in Elysium, he writes that the deforestation is so vast, so criminal in all of England, primarily for wood sourcing and quite specifically for the defense of the nation, shipbuilding, that he argues that if the state isn't involved, the state won't be able to defend itself. And so you have, there 350 or 400 years ago already the implication that the state is involved.
And also we see clearly your idea of exporting that, because as soon as wood stocks were found in the New World, then all of a sudden England's forestry problem was immediately solved, but it just got exported here and ravaged where we're sitting. So I think there's a really interesting parallel.
Good morning. Thank you for your talks. I'd like to add a question to the monitoring and carbon capture side, if I may. Read a paper several years ago from Pamela Templar's group at BU, and you'll forgive my inexact summary, but she found, or their group found, that the decreased snowfall decreased the amount of insulation over the root zone of trees, leading to greater exposure to freeze-thaw cycles and exudate leakage from the roots, and a 60% reduction in carbon capture estimated in those tree stocks that were exposed to that greater freeze-thaw cycle. And I wonder if you have any updates to that finding, particularly in light of the almost snowless winter that we've had here, and the worrisome trend that may herald. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that work well. Half of that project was done at the Harvard Forest, and the other half was done at Hubbard Brook, which is our sibling forest up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. One interesting nuance in that study was that the 60% reduction was from the New Hampshire portion of the study, and those trees evolved with much higher snowpack, whereas the Harvard Forest study, there were differences, but not nearly as significant, and that's because the freeze-thaw cycle and years without snow insulation is just more common in Massachusetts than in New Hampshire. So that issue of root damage through freeze-thaw cycles is very prominent north of here. It is an issue here. I don't want to say it's not, but it's a bigger issue, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, that is now seeing these species, sugar maple, and even just the plasticity within species just don't have the ability to withstand the amount of freeze-thaw, whereas the red maples and the oaks seem to put up with it a little better and have somewhat deeper roots to contend with it. But this is just the sort of unseen aspects of climate change, like that's not your first thought, right? How will climate change impact trees? Will it impact them because the roots will be damaged because they will be frozen more because it is warmer? Well, yes, because there isn't the insulation from the snow. And that's just Pam's brilliant, and her group did a brilliant study to show that.
I have a question regarding grasslands and meadows and mangroves. It seems like it's not included in your study, and I'm wondering about the effectiveness of carbon sequestration regarding also to these types of landscapes that are not at least discussed here as much as I understood.
I feel like I'm talking too much, I'm sorry. Well, first, I talk about forests because I'm a forest ecologist, so that, and so with that as a caveat, I'll say that, the ability for meadows in particular to sequester carbon in the soils is real and being advocated, but remember that the only way that carbon gets into the soil is through photosynthesis, and the ability for grasslands to photosynthesize is just lower than the ability of a tree or something with just more leaf area and more stomata and more ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. So it's real, but it won't compete with forests. But you did mention mangroves as well, and those are, if not among the most carbon dense ecosystems on Earth, both because they have a lot of leaf area and they have anaerobic conditions to store the carbon, which will stay for millennia. And so there are real opportunities to rehab mangroves. Unfortunately, the pace of mangrove destruction is much larger than the pace of mangrove restoration. And so it's more of a sad story despite that potential.
I think we have time for one more question. We'll go to Kira.
Thank you all so much for all of your talks. Something that kind of struck me is how class is kind of embedded in all of these, where we have Dick Turpin, who is kind of excused for his crimes from stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, and then carbon sequestration kind of offering the people with the time to tally their emissions, the ability to pay them off, but just the reality that on the ground, a lot of forestry jobs do not pay particularly well, especially when you're trying to pay rent in a city. And so I'm wondering if you can each kind of talk about how labor impacts the management of urban forests and then also rural forests throughout Massachusetts or Broadway.
Dave, do you want to get a start on that question?
Yeah, many cities probably do not have urban forestry as a profession in their cities. Some do, and they're probably not paid as well as they should be. So, and the influence of that is so it's a lot of it goes to the private sector to take care of the trees, where the public has to pay, or the private citizens have to pay for the action. So you basically have two processes: the private market creating jobs for the private, and then you have a public market which either puts money into it or not, which will either hire private contractors or public employees. So there are some cities are getting more progressive. I think there's a reason why the public dollars should go into private properties in terms of stimulating forest growth as a public good, as a positive externality to everybody. But the jobs do not pay that well in forestry compared to some other fields. Plus, the other issue is trying to get people to go into that field in the first place and getting enough student base to fill those jobs coming out.
Sorry. Maybe I'll say something really quick. I'm not sure labor in the 17th and 18th century would be the word that would have been used, but I think it's important to remember just really broadly that there was a pretty big shift in terms of economies going on, and what we would now describe as a very clear class division, where poorer people were relying on forests for subsistence economies, poaching for food, and these were uncontested practices. This was sort of commoning that was beginning to become codified and then outlawed. So a figure like Turpin is super interesting because there's a shift where these subsistence economies are no longer viable in the same ways because they're being outlawed. At the same time, it's harder to make a sort of what was called an honest living. And so the highwaymen sort of evolved out of those practices. And I think it's really fascinating that poaching was now considered in a specific kind of legal category in a similar way to robbing, whereas before it would have been much more clearly just subsistence farming in a way that other peasants would have also used forest and the fields around the forests. Yeah.
Just a few quick points on that thought. I don't know what to make of U.S. News and World Report putting out surveys, but you read these things, and the one I've read recently had forestry with the highest job satisfaction of any professional degree, which, take it for what it's worth. But at the same time, forestry schools are going away. And it's a professional training. There's a difference between being a logger and a professional forester in silviculturist. And they're vanishingly few graduates from professional forestry programs. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but the biggest one I notice is the mechanization and the expense of mechanization in forestry, particularly in harvesting in forestry. So this isn't in an urban application, but this is to produce wood and fiber. I work a lot in Maine, but even here in Massachusetts, when the state recently shut down logging on public lands to reevaluate it, the complaint was, you told me we were going to do this certain type of low-impact forestry, and so I invested $500,000 in a feller buncher, and I pay a mortgage on that of $50,000 a month, and now I have no more contracts. Indeed, the contracts I had with you that were for 10 years to the state are now on pause, and now I still have this mortgage that I'm supposed to pay. So what am I supposed to do? So now I'm knocking on doors, and I'm going to all the private lands where I don't have the restrictions I had on state lands to do low-impact forestry. So I'm going in just because I got to pay my bills, and those guys are pretty frustrated. U.S. News and World Report did not survey those guys. But it is the mechanization of this work that those machines, if you've ever seen them, can do the job of what used to be many, many, many people.
I just realized we had a new lease on life, so I have a couple more minutes for questions. And also, I have one follow-up question, mostly for Dave and Jonathan. And this had to do, Jonathan used this very nice term, fix this through forestry. And you gave a very interesting example, almost the opposite, which was the instance where solar panels, despite our kind of image of virtue, in fact have deleterious effects. And Ned had a very interesting comment last night about, and this is very common among my students, where they attribute certain feelings or sentiments to trees, which they might not possess, but it helps us kind of relate to them in some way. So the larger question really, this for you, Dave, as well, is like, what things are we doing that we think are right, which might be wrong? And, how might we reorient the question so we understand it better?
Go ahead, Dave.
Am I going?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Oh, sorry, okay, I didn't hear you. Yeah, I think what we're doing, what we think is right, that is wrong in terms of urbanization, is this push for tax dollars and development over the environment, is that we're discounting nature as having limited to no value, and the development processes of jobs and economy and taxes as the main driver. And not that they aren't important, but they shouldn't be all consuming in the process, that there's a balance that needs to be struck in the development when we make these cities, that there is a value to having these forests, allowing them to regenerate, using nature to provide these services that can't be provided in many ways through mechanization.
So I live out in Western Mass, in a very rural area, and there are yard signs in maybe 10 to 20% of the yards that say solar and forest, can we have both? Or about this debate around building solar farms in forests. Between 2010 and 2020, there was 10,000 acres of utility scale solar built in Massachusetts. 65% of that, so 6,500 acres of forest, were cut down to make way for solar panels. And so it's true in one sense that, a very limited sense, that the carbon calculations are better for solar, but it's worth remembering that solar does not sequester any carbon at all, right? Its ability to affect the carbon budget is equivalent to the fossil fuels that are not burned because the solar produced the energy, right? And so their effort in the decarbonization or on the emissions reduction side, and that they decrease over time as the grid becomes greener and greener. They're displacing greener and greener grid carbon intensity, right? The other thing is that we need trees to sequester carbon. We don't know how, David Keith's machine notwithstanding, we are not really good at sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. While 420 so parts per million is unprecedented and scary, it's still a little bit, right? And so that makes it just hard to do, to get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's very energy intensive, whereas trees just do it for us. And so cutting down the trees to make way for an emissions reduction procedure just seems really short-sighted. We just wrote a report, Mass Audubon and the Harvard Forest, called Growing Solar Protecting Nature, where we did this really highly detailed mapping effort in Massachusetts and showed that we can get 25 gigawatts of solar electricity without cutting down any trees in the state, using a lot of ground mount solar. But it's going to use a lot of the developed open space, including a lot of big backyards. I need a YIMBY program, the Yes in My Backyard program for this to build all the solar panels. It needs to be on the road medians, yes, on the rooftops, of course. And if you can do it on the parking lots, though they're about 3 times more expensive to do it on parking lots. So while we all love them, it's hard on an economic sense to do that. But there's just no reason when we can get, when we've used all the developed open space with solar and you want to talk about going into forest, then I'm willing to have that conversation. But while we still have so much to choose from, it just seems just ridiculous. And it's driven by where the cheap land is. That's the whole game.
Ed, thanks. I want to go back to a minute to the urban forest through a passage in Kira's question and some of what Dave has said this morning. In the urban forest work that we've done, my firm and my partner Eric is going to speak about this in another panel. There is a sort of a political economy to the stemming the loss and growing the canopy. And I think it's not a labor question so much as it is resource question. So in Cambridge, the 2 largest landowners manage part of the urban forest, MIT and Harvard. The numbers are very different of coverage. Harvard has a lot of coverage. MIT has well below what they ought to and will in the future. And part of the political economy is the mitigation that's required when trees are taken down to build, in Dave's term, more impervious surface, which continues to happen in Alston and everywhere else. So one of the big problems for Boston, I think, and Amy Whitesides might either concur or deny this, some of the big spaces are owned by the Department of Parks. And they are so strapped for resources that they cannot hoist up what Cambridge has been able to do through mitigation. And because a lot of the loss that we've registered in the last decade happens to be for the expansion of homes, the affordable housing, the new Affordable Housing Act, where you can basically build affordable multifamily housing on any lot in the city. You're free to do that now with the city council's move a couple of years ago. So the loss continues, and the resources to reverse the curve or reverse the equation are simply not there.
Thank you. And I appreciate your comments, Gary. And I just wanted to go back to Jonathan's statement that just blew me away about the cutting of the forest and the thousands of trees for the solar fields. And I think going back to the land ownership question a bit is just a question to you. Who owned that land and how did that happen? And what can we do to prevent that from happening in the future?
So 70% of the land in Massachusetts is privately owned by 200,000 different landowners. So this is the sort of tyranny of small decisions problem, right? If you own a woodlot in Western Massachusetts, and you're going to pay taxes on it, you're going to pay Massachusetts-style taxes, even if you're in current use provision. So it's a economic liability to own that land, and you might reasonably look for some way for that land to pay back, right? So would forestry be your option? Well, if it is, it's going to be on the tune of like once every 30 or 40 years. We find in Massachusetts, private landowners don't make decisions about harvesting based on good forest management. They make decisions because they had a divorce, or there's a tuition payment, or somebody died, or these are the reasons that our forests get managed, because people need the influx of money. Now they have major energy companies knocking on their door, saying, I'll lease that land from you at upwards of $15,000 to $20,000 per acre per year for the next 30 years. Many people have 100 or so acre. That's real money that forestry just can't even come close to. The communities are out-lawyered by this. You know, in Massachusetts, 351 individual communities, 351 planning boards. Most of them are meeting in the basement of the town hall. They're run by retirees, and you have energy company attorneys coming in to argue about solar siting in the communities. And this would then pay a bunch more property taxes once the land is valued for solar. So it's really an uphill battle. There was recently a judicial land court ruling that did give a lot of power to the town. The largest landowner in the private landowner in the state is Cinda Jones in Coles Lumber, and she's proposing the largest solar installation, 1,300 acres, in Sunderland, Massachusetts, which is a town I drive through on my way to the Harvard Forest every morning. And she says, listen, it's less than 10% of my land. I'll put the rest of my land in conservation easement forever. We'll solve the climate crisis, and I'll fix the school problem at the same time. I'm working for the schools. I'm working for the climate. I'm doing $15,000 of conservation. You really don't want me to do that? I really don't want you to do that. But it is a hard argument to have. You know, it is not simple. And so that's really what we're up against.
Yeah, great. This is on, yeah? Yeah, so I'll just, yes, confirm, and I'll speak later at 2 o'clock. Please come back. I'll speak to Gary's comment about just resources, and a little bit also to Kira's question around labor, in particular in the city. The thing that I was also very much struck by this kind of decision-making, and I love the way you put it, this tyranny of small decisions. And I've also been, whoever you borrowed it from, brilliant. Yeah. But I've been struck this whole time about the way in which this group was put together, which, you know, beginning with very much a cultural history, you know, this history of the sort of outlaw and a relationship to the forest, the sort of forest as the place of, you know, where unsavory things happen. And then shifting gears to science and monitoring, and initially thinking, how do these go? You know, two of these things are not like the other, right? But the more we're talking, and I think especially with Max's question, it really strikes me that so much of this has to do with just a very broken understanding or relationship to the natural world, or nature as we call it, you know, between culture and nature. And that, like, kind of therein lies the problem. And so how do we, you know, I think obviously this is an enormous question, but I'm thinking in the context of this conversation, you know, how do we think about that when we're looking at these kinds of decisions that get made just because the economics of it work for the individual? And that's problematic when we're looking at the complexity of trying to make decisions to really reduce, to adapt to climate risks, which are really not so much a problem for the environment, but for a problem for the people who have built stuff in and amongst the environment that is shifting and changing and won't necessarily, work for us in the conditions that we're in. So I know that's an enormous question, but, trying to, linking a little bit or going back to maybe some of the kind of cultural challenges, maybe a better way to put that is like cultural challenges that you face as scientists. How does that play into the work that you're doing, or how you're communicating this? Sorry.
Anybody else want that one? It's a huge question. I feel very, very lucky. The Harvard Forest is a magical place, right? It is 50% Ivy League science and 50% blue-collar, boots on the ground. We have tractors and sawmills and miles of trails and streams and moose and bear. And I feel just tremendously lucky to be a part of that place. I think it gives me this perspective of land that I wish more people could have. I have no association with urban systems at all, the way I think many of you feel close to a city. I feel close to a forest, and I think, how can I get more people out into the forest and see both the science of it and the rural livelihoods and the what comes along with it. So just speaking personally, for me, that's what allows me to kind of have a foot in both worlds.
I want to give Lisa a chance to talk, but just one comment you made, Amy, I thought was very interesting about the potential disjuncture between the two papers and our paper. And at the risk of being provocative, why not? I think that perception stems from our a recent and I hope temporary loss of either the willingness or capacity to see things like forests historically or rivers historically. We see them as kind of functional systems, or they're invested with rights, whatever we might want to do. But to my mind, when I was looking forward to the papers, I saw perfect continuity in terms of the questions and approaches. It's just history and certain forms of discourse have been slightly in abeyance in our field recently. So I'm just saying that a tiny bit defensively, but yeah.
But part of it has to do also with the way that these are, you can see if you look at earlier ideas of forest, how clearly it's been constructed in certain ways as a place of outlaw. This is a very specific political position that was constructed by people that wanted to control the forest to make money out of it. So in that way, I see a very clear continuity between a political elite and then a moneyed elite that have every reason to want to paint the forest in this kind of way that's sort of teeming with outlaws and so on. And I don't know what the contemporary version of that is, but. Well, no, like what is the like today's version of the outlaw hiding in the forest? I don't really know, but I think that we are still living with certain legacies. Like these legacies have long-standing effects. So, and I don't quite know how to track it specifically, but.
Well, one thing, if I could add one.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say. One of the things to consider about the cultural change is that about 100 years ago, we were, as a nation, probably around 20% urban, 80% rural population. Now we've shifted to over 80% urban population, 20% rural. So we're losing that connection to land. We're not being raised on the forests and the farms. So we're getting to this position of not understanding, probably as well as we did in the past, the value of nature. And I think the cultural shift has to go back to education, because our next generation of managers are now in school. And we find in my profession, we're always teaching the manager after the fact that nature has this role, where they're not coming into the position understanding it, because we're being raised in an urban technology society and not a rural-based, land-based society.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. San? I think in answer to who's the outlaws, I think the homeless, in some ways have become the outlaws, and as they tend to find places to live and forests and use subsistence and some other things that maybe you were talking about. So I just wanted to add that in answer to your.
Yeah, it's time. So I wanted to thank our panelists, Dave, Jonathan, and Lisa. It's just been a really wonderful discussion, and thank you, the audience, for your interventions, and call this session to a close. Thank you all.